In the forests of the Ardennes, on that freezing December morning in 1944, an SS lieutenant colonel named Joachim Peiper found himself caught in a peculiar contradiction. His armoured column was slicing through American positions with the kind of precision and violence that had made the German Panzerwaffe legendary. The initial hours of the offensive seemed to validate every wild promise that had been made back at headquarters. His Kampfgruppe, hand-picked to serve as the spearhead of what Hitler had grandiose titled Operation Wacht am Rhein, was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, creating panic, sowing confusion, breaking through. Yet Peiper wasn't looking at the enemy soldiers scrambling before his tanks. His attention was focused on something far more mundane and infinitely more terrifying. The fuel gauges. Every single one of them was dropping with a relentlessness that no amount of tactical brilliance could arrest. Each time one of his massive Tigers lurched forward through the snow, each time a Panther's engine roared to climb an icy slope, precious gasoline disappeared into the mechanical maw of these steel beasts. The entire offensive, this last desperate throw of Germany's remaining military dice, rested on a foundation that was equal parts audacity, surprise, and something that military planners rarely admit to relying upon. Hope, more specifically, hope for fuel. The commanders had been quite explicit in their briefings. The Americans, they said, would provide what Germany could not. These soft, undisciplined Americans, with their wasteful habits, would abandon their supplies in the face of superior German fighting spirit. The advancing panzers would simply take what they needed from the fleeing enemy. It was, when you stopped to think about it for more than a moment, an extraordinary assumption upon which to base the last major offensive of the war. But these were extraordinary times, and desperation has a way of making the improbable seem inevitable. And then, in those snow-covered Belgian woods, something remarkable happened, something that seemed to validate the entire mad premise. Peiper's men stumbled onto an American fuel depot. For those first electric moments, it must have felt like divine providence, like the universe itself had decided that perhaps Germany deserved one more miracle. But what they discovered in that forest wasn't going to be their salvation. It was going to be something far different and far more devastating. It was going to be a measurement, a way of understanding, with brutal mathematical precision, just how thoroughly they had already lost this war. What they found among those stacked jerry cans and fuel drums was proof of how completely American industrial logistics would crush Hitler's final gamble. Let's step back for a moment and understand the situation Germany found itself in by the autumn of 1944. The Third Reich was being squeezed from two directions, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. From the east, the Red Army was advancing with the kind of methodical, grinding determination that seemed unstoppable. From the west, Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and were sitting at Germany's doorstep. If you were a realistic member of the German High Command, the picture was unambiguously catastrophic. Every metric, every map, every intelligence report screamed the same conclusion. The war was lost. But inside Adolf Hitler's mind, that same catastrophic situation looked entirely different. He saw it as an opportunity for one final masterwork of military genius. One last grand operation that would shatter the Allied coalition and turn the tide of the war. The plan he conceived was so audacious that many of his own generals thought he had completely lost touch with reality. 3 entire German armies would concentrate in secret. The best panzer divisions that could still be scraped together would form the armoured fist. They would punch through what intelligence suggested was a weakly held section of the American line in the Ardennes forest. The same forest, ironically, that Germany had used for its invasion route in 1940. Once through, they would drive hard for the Meuse River. Cross it. Keep driving. The objective was Antwerp, that vital Belgian port where Allied supplies flowed into Europe. Hitler's vision went beyond merely capturing the city. He told his generals that taking Antwerp would split the British and American armies, creating chaos in the Allied command structure. More importantly, he promised them that Antwerp's massive stockpiles would resupply the German armies. The fuel, the ammunition, the food, all of it would fall into German hands and sustain the next phase of operations. This wasn't just part of the plan. This was the essential core of the plan. Germany would resupply itself from captured enemy stores. This reliance on enemy supplies wasn't born from strategic preference. It came from grinding necessity. By late 1944, Germany was hemorrhaging resources at a rate that couldn't be sustained. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had been brutally effective against synthetic fuel production facilities. The complex plants that turned coal into gasoline had been systematically targeted and destroyed. Production had collapsed by roughly 90% from its peak. The great Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, which had kept the Wehrmacht mobile for years, were now in Soviet hands. The effects of this fuel starvation rippled through every aspect of German military and civilian life. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German arms, was largely grounded. It didn't matter that German engineers had developed jets that were technically superior to anything the Allies flew. Those jets needed kerosene, and there simply wasn't enough to keep them in the air in meaningful numbers. On German streets, civilian vehicles had become almost invisible. The few cars still running were typically official vehicles, or those belonging to high-ranking party members. The Gestapo was spending resources hunting down black market fuel dealers, treating them with the same seriousness as enemy spies. The numbers tell a stark story. During 1944, the entire German war economy, with all its occupied territories and remaining resources, produced approximately 33 million barrels of oil. In that same year, the United States alone produced 1.8 billion barrels. Think about that ratio for a moment. A single American oil field in East Texas produced more petroleum than all of German-controlled Europe combined. While American refineries were so flush with crude oil that they were experimenting with ways to use the excess, German quartermasters were making agonizing decisions about which units would receive fuel and which would have to sit idle. When Hitler's generals sat down to calculate the fuel requirements for this offensive, they arrived at a sobering conclusion. They had enough gasoline on hand to get the spearhead forces roughly one-third of the way to Antwerp. After that, the plan assumed the Americans would provide the rest. It was a gamble built on hope, and as the panzers began rolling forward into the snow on December 16th, every crew member knew they were riding on borrowed time and borrowed fuel. The armoured spearhead of this offensive was assigned to the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by SS General Sepp Dietrich. Dietrich was a long-time Nazi loyalist, one of those men who had been with Hitler since the early days of the party. His most effective tool was Kampfgruppe Peiper. These weren't just soldiers. They were the distilled essence of what the SS considered the ideal fighting man. Fanatical loyalty, extensive combat experience, equipped with the finest weapons the shrinking German war machine could provide. They were riding in some of the most fearsome armoured vehicles ever constructed. The Tiger II heavy tank was a monster. Its thick, sloped armour made it virtually impervious to frontal attack from any Allied tank gun. The 88mm cannon it carried could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. The Panther medium tank was, by many measures, the finest balanced tank design of the entire war. Good armour, good speed, devastating firepower. But these mechanical marvels shared a critical flaw. They were incredibly thirsty. Peiper knew the numbers intimately because his ability to advance depended on them. Each Tiger II consumed approximately 2.5 gallons of gasoline for every single mile it travelled under ideal conditions. In the rough terrain of the Ardennes, with its hills and forests and muddy trails, that consumption could easily double. To put it in perspective, for every gallon of fuel that an American Sherman tank burned, a Tiger II burned 3. For a nation that had no fuel to spare, building an army around such gas-guzzling vehicles was a paradox. It reflected a philosophy that had guided German military thinking for years, the belief that superior quality would always triumph over mere quantity, that a smaller number of excellent machines operated by superior soldiers could defeat a larger number of inferior weapons. But that philosophy has a fatal flaw. It ignores the basic truth that a tank which cannot move is no longer a tank. It's just an extremely expensive stationary gun position. And keeping these mechanical predators moving was a logistical nightmare that grew worse by the day. The variety of vehicles in a typical Panzer division, once considered a strength that allowed for flexibility, had become a liability. Different engines required different types of fuel. Different tanks needed different spare parts. The supply chain had to accommodate this complexity, and by late 1944 that supply chain was hanging by threads. Moving fuel to the front required trucks, lots of trucks. Each one of those trucks was a priority target for Allied fighter bombers. The dreaded J-Boss, as German soldiers called them, owned the skies. They hunted German supply columns with ruthless efficiency. Every gallon of gasoline that reached a panzer at the front had survived a gauntlet of Allied air attacks, partisan ambushes, and the simple mechanical failures that plagued an overtaxed transportation network. By December, the German supply situation had devolved into a study in desperation and improvisation. Fuel was siphoned from damaged vehicles before they were abandoned. Captured Allied jeeps were immediately drained of every drop. A commander like Peiper might have nearly 100 tanks under his command, but if he only had enough fuel to move 30 of them, his effective combat power was reduced by 70%. The plan was for these thirsty predators to sustain themselves by feeding on the logistical arteries of their enemy. They were hunters being sent into the wild, expected to survive by consuming their prey. While Germany was fighting a war on fumes and desperation, America was prosecuting a global conflict while swimming in petroleum. To the average American soldier, fuel was just there. It was as reliable and unremarkable as the air he breathed. The colossal system that made this possible was one of the great logistical achievements in military history, though it rarely gets the recognition it deserves. At the heart of this system was something called the Red Ball Express. When Allied armies broke out of Normandy and began racing across France, they advanced so quickly that they outran their supply lines. The solution that was improvised on the fly became legendary. A dedicated one-way loop of roads was closed to all other traffic. On these roads, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a continuous convoy of trucks moved supplies forward. At the peak of operations, nearly 6,000 trucks were involved. Most of them were rugged GMC 2.5-ton trucks, affectionately called Jimmies by the men who drove them. The majority of these drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated units in an army that wouldn't fully integrate for years yet. Despite facing discrimination and prejudice, they kept the supplies flowing. In just 82 days of operation, the Red Ball Express delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies to the advancing armies. The operation itself consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel per day just to keep its own trucks running. A German army group commander would have wept to see that much fuel being used just for transportation. But that was merely one component of the system. An even more impressive achievement was Operation Pluto, which stood for Pipeline Under the Ocean. Engineers laid flexible 3-inch diameter pipelines across the English Channel from England to France. Through these pipelines, fuel flowed continuously, pumped directly from British refineries to the continent. It was an unstoppable river of petroleum. From the coastal depots where these pipelines terminated, smaller pipeline networks branched out, following the armies as they advanced. Like a circulatory system delivering oxygen to the body's extremities, these pipelines delivered hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel daily to wherever it was needed. In late 1944, Allied forces in Western Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons of fuel every single day. The US First Army, the very force that would bear the brunt of the German attack in the Ardennes, maintained a strategic reserve of 3.5 million gallons. Just one of the larger pipelines feeding the front could deliver 300,000 gallons in 24 hours. This wasn't merely a numerical advantage, though the numbers were certainly overwhelming. It represented a fundamental difference in how the two sides approached warfare. This abundance changed the entire American mindset. American commanders planned operations with the comfortable assumption that fuel would be available. They didn't have to agonize over whether they could afford a particular attack or maneuver. While German generals were calculating routes down to the individual kilometer, trying to conserve every liter of precious gasoline, American generals were planning operational movements that spanned entire countries. This rolling tide of petroleum was about to crash headlong into the sputtering, fuel-starved advance of the German panzers. December 16th arrived, and the Ardennes forest exploded into violence. The German offensive achieved complete tactical surprise. Through the gaps torn in the American lines poured the men and machines of Kampfgruppe Peiper, along with the other assault formations. For Peiper's column, every minute of advance was a race, not primarily against the enemy, but against their own fuel tanks. The needles on those gauges kept dropping, and every commander knew that when they hit empty, the offensive was over. Then, near a small village called Honsfeld, they found it. Overrunning what turned out to be a rest area for an American armored division, Peiper's men discovered a U.S. fuel and supply depot. For soldiers who had spent years scrounging for every drop of ersatz fuel, for men who had watched their nation's fuel supplies dwindle to almost nothing, what they saw must have seemed like a mirage. But it was real. A German officer who was there later described what he saw. Walls of American-made jerry cans, sturdy and well-constructed, stacked 10 feet high. The cans formed long corridors through the forest. The air, which had been filled with the smell of pine and snow, now carried the sharp, almost intoxicating scent of high-octane gasoline, 80-plus octane, real gasoline, not the 74-octane substitute that German engines were forced to run on. The initial estimates reported 50,000 gallons. 50,000 gallons in one minor depot at one small village. This single capture represented more fuel than many German divisions had seen in months. It was enough to refuel Peiper's entire battle group and power their dash toward the Meuse River. The men were ecstatic. Some of them probably laughed. This was exactly what they had been promised. The decadent, wasteful Americans were careless with their wealth. The disciplined German soldier would seize it and turn it toward victory. For a brief moment in that cold forest, the entire mad gamble seemed to be paying off. Hope, a resource that had become even scarcer than fuel in the German army, surged through the ranks. They had found their El Dorado, their city of gold, the prize that would carry them forward to ultimate triumph. But as German officers began organizing this miraculous bounty, as they started planning how to distribute it among the vehicles, something began to feel wrong. Among the crates of rations and ammunition, soldiers found discarded American newspapers. On the jerry cans themselves, there were shipping manifests and labels. Some logistics officer, probably one of those meticulous types that every army produces, started reading these documents carefully. And as he read, a cold, creeping dread must have settled over him. The newspapers were recent, very recent. They contained news of events from just days ago, but it was the shipping manifests that told the truly devastating story. These jerry cans, filled with gasoline that had been refined in Texas or California or Oklahoma, had been shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. They had come through the port at Antwerp, the very objective that Kampfgruppe Peiper was racing to capture. They had been loaded onto trains or trucks. They had travelled through multiple supply depots. They had been transported to this minor rest area in the Ardennes. And according to the manifests, this shipment was one of dozens that had arrived in the past week alone. Think about what that meant. This wasn't some strategic reserve that the Americans had painstakingly built up over months. This was routine resupply. The paperwork made it clear that fuel deliveries of this scale were arriving constantly, flowing through a logistics pipeline that treated 50,000 gallons as routine rather than miraculous. One of the manifests referenced a pipeline, a single pipeline, that could deliver 300,000 gallons of fuel every day. 300,000 gallons. In one day. From one pipeline. A German panzer division, fighting at high intensity, might burn through 300,000 gallons in a month. Here was an invisible tube in the ground, carrying fuel continuously, that could deliver in 24 hours what a German division would consider a month's intensive consumption. Suddenly, that 50,000-gallon discovery didn't seem like a jackpot anymore. It was pocket change. It was the equivalent of a millionaire dropping a $20 bill on the sidewalk and not bothering to bend down and pick it up because it wasn't worth the effort. The Americans hadn't lost this fuel in any meaningful sense. Its loss wasn't even a significant inconvenience. It was a rounding error in their vast logistical calculations. The German soldiers standing in that forest, reading those manifests and newspapers, began to understand something profound and soul-crushing. For years, German propaganda had painted America as a soft, mongrel nation, a country of shopkeepers and businessmen with no stomach for total war, a place where jazz music and Hollywood movies had corrupted any martial virtue. That comforting lie was now lying shattered in the Belgian snow. As one German soldier later wrote in a letter that was captured, there was a profound sense of demoralization that set in, not from being defeated in combat, not from facing superior tactics or better weapons, but from the sudden, undeniable recognition of the sheer material wealth that stood behind the American soldier. How could you possibly defeat an enemy who treated what would be a war-winning treasure for your entire army as little more than a rounding error? An enemy who could lose 50,000 gallons of fuel and not even notice it was gone? The discovery of that fuel dump near Honsfeld was supposed to be a turning point, and in a sense it was, but not in the way the Germans had hoped. It was the moment when many of them understood, with cold mathematical certainty, that this war was already over. It had probably been over for a long time, but they had been able to avoid seeing it clearly. Now, standing among all those jerry cans, reading those shipping manifests, the reality was impossible to deny. This psychological shift from tactical victory to strategic despair is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Battle of the Bulge. It demonstrates that wars are won not just through combat prowess on the battlefield, but through the unglamorous work of logistics and industrial production. The factory floor was as important as the front line. And the minds of the soldiers, their belief in the possibility of victory, mattered as much as the weapons they carried. But the true mind-bending extent of American material power wasn't demonstrated by the fuel the Germans managed to capture. It was shown by the fuel they were denied. American commanders, once they understood the scale of the German offensive, made a simple and ruthless calculation. If the Germans needed captured fuel to sustain their advance, then that fuel had to be destroyed. What followed was an act of material destruction so profound, so utterly alien to the German mindset, that it became one of the war's most stunning demonstrations of industrial supremacy. Near the town of Stavelot, directly in Kampfgruppe Peiper's projected line of advance, there was another American fuel depot. This one didn't contain 50,000 gallons. It held 2.5 million gallons. 2.5 million gallons of high-grade gasoline, sitting in drums and tanks, waiting to fuel American operations. As Peiper's lead elements approached, a small group of American combat engineers received their orders. Destroy it. All of it. Try to imagine this from the German perspective. Your tanks are running on vapors. Your nation's last desperate hope for turning the war around is grinding to a halt because you don't have fuel. And then, over the next ridge, you see a pillar of black smoke rising into the winter sky. You hear the roar of flames. You get close enough to see American soldiers methodically going from one fuel storage tank to another, opening valves, letting thousands of gallons of precious gasoline pour out into drainage ditches, and then setting it on fire, watching it burn, deliberately, intentionally destroying more fuel in an afternoon than your entire army group had been allocated for the entire offensive. At Stavelot, at Malmedy, at Spa, the story was repeated. American engineers went to fuel depots that sat in the path of the German advance. They opened valves, they placed demolition charges, they tossed grenades into fuel storage areas, and they watched millions of gallons of gasoline go up in flames. In the first week of the battle alone, American forces deliberately destroyed approximately 8 million gallons of fuel. 8 million gallons. To put that in perspective, that single week of intentional destruction represented more gasoline than the German High Command had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. To the Germans, watching this or hearing reports of it, the waste was incomprehensible. It was like watching a starving man deliberately burn down a building full of food. It violated every instinct that had been drilled into German soldiers about the preciousness of resources and the necessity of conservation. But to the Americans, it was simply sound military doctrine. The loss was trivial. The supply chain was already compensating for it. New fuel was arriving to replace what had been destroyed. On December 17th, the US First Army destroyed 2.2 million gallons of fuel to keep it from falling into German hands. The very next day, December 18th, 1.8 million gallons of fuel were delivered to that same army through the normal supply pipeline. And by Christmas Eve, just over a week into the battle, the First Army's total fuel reserves had actually increased compared to what they had been when the offensive started. They had destroyed millions of gallons and still ended up with more fuel than they had at the beginning. This act sealed Kampfgruppe Peiper's fate. Blocked by increasingly stubborn American resistance, denied the captured fuel they desperately needed because it had literally gone up in smoke, their advance sputtered to a halt near a small town called La Glaise. Peiper's mighty Tiger, 2 tanks, those fearsome predators that were supposed to spearhead the drive to Antwerp, became immobile steel coffins. They sat there out of fuel, unable to move forward or retreat. On Christmas Eve, Peiper was forced to give the order to abandon them. All of them. His men destroyed their own vehicles to keep them from being captured, and then tried to make their way back to German lines on foot. Of the 5,000 elite SS soldiers who had started the attack with Kampfgruppe Peiper, only about 800 made it back. They had been defeated by many things, American resistance certainly, determined stands by small groups of soldiers who bought time for reinforcements to arrive. But ultimately, they were beaten by empty fuel gauges and an enemy who could afford to fight with fire itself as a weapon. When the guns finally fell silent in late January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was celebrated as a great American victory. And it was a victory, make no mistake. American soldiers had fought with courage and determination against a skilled and desperate enemy. But in a very real sense, the battle was won long before the first shot was fired on December 16th. It was won in the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma. It was won in the refineries that dotted the American coastline. It was won in the shipyards that built the tankers that carried petroleum across the Atlantic. It was won in the minds of the engineers who designed pipelines that could be laid under the ocean. In 1944, the United States produced more than 50 times as much crude oil as Germany. While German industry was being systematically destroyed by bombing campaigns, Ford's Willow Run factory in Michigan was churning out a complete B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. American shipyards were launching cargo ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. The industrial disparity was so vast that it's almost difficult to comprehend. The Battle of the Bulge was the moment when this statistical reality became an undeniable psychological truth for the soldiers experiencing it. It marked the brutal end of the romantic notion that willpower and fighting spirit could triumph over material disadvantage. The image of the dashing Panzer ace, the skilled tank commander achieving miracles through tactical brilliance, was made obsolete by the anonymous truck driver on the Red Ball Express, delivering his 1,000th load of fuel without any glory or recognition. Winston Churchill, when he reflected on the war, said that petrol governed every movement. Joseph Stalin, in his characteristically blunt way, stated that the war had been decided by engines and octane. Both men understood what the German soldiers learned in that Belgian forest. The German soldiers who stumbled onto that fuel dump near Honsfeld thought they had found the key to victory. What they had actually discovered was a measuring stick. a way to understand the vast, unbridgeable chasm between their exhausted, depleted nation and the industrial colossus they had so foolishly decided to fight. They were bringing swords to a battle against an enemy wielding an entire production line. The story of the Battle of the Bulge and the American fuel dumps serves as a microcosm of the entire Second World War. The discovery of that one stockpile, representing more wealth than an entire German division could dream of possessing, became a symbol of what the war had become. It had moved beyond battles between soldiers and tanks. It had become a clash between two fundamentally different systems. One system was running on the last fumes of a fanatical ideology, squeezing every drop of performance from a depleted industrial base. The other was powered by what seemed like an almost limitless river of industrial production, flowing from a homeland that was safe from bombing and growing more productive every month. The German soldiers' shock wasn't just about finding the fuel. It was about what that fuel represented. It was the soul-crushing realization that they were fighting an enemy who could afford to be wasteful on a scale they couldn't even imagine in their most pessimistic moments. An enemy for whom the loss of millions of gallons of fuel was such a minor inconvenience that it barely registered in the strategic calculations. It proved that in modern, industrialized warfare, the greatest weapon isn't always the newest tank or the most skilled soldier. Sometimes the greatest weapon is simply the ability to supply your armies endlessly, to replace every loss, to treat vast quantities of resources as expendable. The lesson went beyond just fuel, of course. It applied to every aspect of the war. When American forces lost tanks in battle, new ones arrived from factories in Detroit within weeks. When the Luftwaffe shot down American bombers, the losses were replaced faster than they could be inflicted. When U-boats sank cargo ships, American shipyards built replacements at a pace that made the losses irrelevant. Germany was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy who could not be attrited. It was a mathematical impossibility that willpower alone could never overcome. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge consumed the last effective mobile reserves that Germany possessed. The offensive failed to reach any of its objectives. Antwerp remained in Allied hands, its port continuing to pour supplies into the Allied war machine. The British and American armies were not split, and rather than re-equipping German forces with captured supplies, the offensive had burned through Germany's last significant fuel reserves for no strategic gain. Within weeks, the Red Army would launch its final offensive in the east. Within months, Allied armies would be crossing the Rhine. Within half a year, the war in Europe would be over. The men of Kampfgruppe Peiper who survived the battle and made it back to German lines carried with them the memory of that fuel dump, the memory of standing in a forest surrounded by more gasoline than they had seen in years, reading shipping manifests that proved it meant nothing to the enemy, and watching pillars of smoke on the horizon where millions more gallons were being deliberately destroyed. That memory told them everything they needed to know about how this war would end. The only question left was how much more destruction would occur before everyone else accepted what they had learned in the Ardennes forest. That they were fighting an enemy who measured resources by different standards, who operated on a scale that made German calculations look like poverty. An enemy who had already won, even if the final battles had yet to be fought.